Just north of Nashville, Tennessee, rests a structure that was once part of an elaborate and vast facility that contributed to not only the economic prosperity of the small town of Greenbrier, Tennessee, but to the growth of Nashville as a whole. Compared to the other well-known Tennessee distilleries that are still in operation today, it seems history has forgotten what was once the most successful whiskey brand in the state, and the man who bought the small still that produced whiskey for his store and turned it into a renowned brand that was exported as far as Paris. Ask locals today, and few will remember the name Charles Nelson, but even fewer will remember the distillery known as Old Number 5. So today I'd like to share with you the incredible story of Charles Nelson and the Greenbrier Distillery. Our story begins in Hagenau, Germany, where Charles was born on July 4th, 1835, to successful businessman John Nelson, who had already accumulated a sizable amount of wealth through his manufacturing industries, producing soap and candles. The small family soon reached a number of 8, with Charles being the oldest of 6 children. Life went on as normal until around 1850, when John decided to move his family to America. He and the family gathered all their belongings that they could and prepared to leave their homeland, and at some point, John decided to have the family's entire fortune converted into gold, which he then had sewn into hidden pockets of a coat that he had altered for such purpose. The vessel that the family was to board was the SS Helena Slauman, Germany's first transatlantic steamer that had already made the trip to America twice before. The family boarded the ship and began to settle in before the ship left Hamburg port on October 26, 1850. The ship was an 800 gross ton vessel with a length of 220 feet by 26 feet and a speed of 9 knots. She had passenger accommodation for 42 first-class passengers, 32 second-class, and 235 steerage class. On November 19th, she was caught in a severe storm that resulted in irreparable damage which led to uncontrollable leaks. While the ship began to sink, the crew and passengers had no choice but to brave the upper decks during the storms. A passing British ship, the SS Devonshire, sighted the sinking vessel and quickly worked to rescue the crew and passengers. They were successful in rescuing all but 9 people, and of those 9 that were dead was the patriarch of the Nelson family. John had somehow fallen into the water, and with the weight of the gold in his coat, he sank to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Nelsons now not only had to deal with the loss of their entire fortune, but they also had to cope with the loss of John. Safe aboard the Devonshire, the family eventually arrived in New York. Once they arrived in New York, Charles' mother took care of his younger siblings, while he and his brother took up local jobs doing the one thing that they knew best: making soap and candles. The family remained here for around 2 years before moving again, this time to Cincinnati, Ohio, where Charles began working as a butcher and would later open a grocery store, having been taught by several in the business about the trade. He ran this business until about 1857, when he decided to relocate to another rapidly growing city, Nashville. Here, he opened another store, called Nelson and Pfeiffer, which quickly became a tremendous success and was popular for its quality meat, exceptionally good coffee, and of course, whiskey that was distilled at a small distillery just north of Nashville. While his whiskey was the most profitable, it would be a shame to skip over his other 2 best-selling products, his coffee and meat, which were supplied by 2 of his friends. And you might not have heard of Joel Cheek, but Nelson preferred his coffee over other suppliers. Joel didn't know it at the time, but he was actually supplying Nelson with what would become the world's most known coffee brand. Joel and his partner, Roger Smith, worked for 2 years to create the perfect blend of coffee, before going from store to store looking for sellers, later meeting Charles and becoming his supplier. Joel eventually took his blend of coffee to the famous Maxwell House Hotel downtown, who enjoyed the coffee's taste so much that it became the hotel's exclusive blend, which we all now know as Maxwell House Coffee. Nelson's other close friend and butcher, H.G. Horace, would later open his own stores, which you might know by the name of H.G. Hills, who would later become the dominant Nashville grocery store chain by 1906 and continues to operate to this day. When he decided to focus on his best-selling product, Charles purchased the distillery producing his whiskey known as Old No. 5 from Charles Palmer of Springfield, who originally opened the site in 1867. It was called Old No. 5 because it was the 5th registered distillery in the district. At the time, it was only producing around 5 gallons a day, so it quickly began to expand operations to meet the overwhelming demand, and the area slowly began to transform from a small farming community to a diverse economy of local manufacturing for materials that were needed for the day-to-day operations of the facility. Corn was grown locally on the farms in the community, and water came from a fresh spring that was piped down and across the creek where it would be used to create the renowned taste that Greenbrier was famous for. After a time, Nelson had a spring house built over the spring to protect the water from impurities before it reached the holding tanks within the buildings. Nelson also bought a patent for a new and improved method of distillation, which greatly expanded the production of his business. In its glory days, the distillery was producing around 380,000 barrels of whiskey, while today's more popular Jack Daniel's distillery was producing around 23,000 at the time, making Nelson's the largest producer in Tennessee. Nelson's famous whiskey also became one of the first to be sold by bottle as well as barrel, but despite local belief, the whiskey was not bottled on site, but transported to town where it was loaded onto a train Nashville bound, where it was then taken and bottled at his warehouse and office, located on Market Street or 2nd Avenue North today, in the buildings where McFadden's once resided. Newspaper reports of local inspectors and journalist visits were always met with the greatest hospitality, that not only reflected the nature of the owner, but of the community itself as a whole. Inspectors were welcomed into a pristinely clean facility that was ran orderly and exceeded expectations. It was noted several times how clean the entire facility was despite the time. One inspector was fascinated that one of the processes included a thorough screening of each grain for even the smallest bit of unwanted material. He also wrote several times of the fresh spring water being as crisp and pure as water could be. And although inspectors and journalists were well fed and well taken care of by the local Greenbrier folk, they always left sober, allegedly, and went on to promise they would return for the annual barbecues, a promise that they kept. Of Nelson, only the best was ever spoke or written of him. He was praised as being a man of truth, honest dealings, and respected for how he ran his business. The site didn't just produce whiskey either. At some point, Charles began producing fruit brandies that became successful ventures as well. Ads for his brand could be found in any Tennessee newspaper, and I even ran across a review he submitted for a hog medicine, praising its use. Although he was German-born, Nelson always declared himself heart and soul an American, while still cherishing a natural respect and affection for his homeland. He, his wife Louisa, and their children would occasionally visit Europe and stop by his village to pay a token of love and affection for his first home. It is said that many of the townspeople would turn out in masses to greet him, for he was the son of a man they were all proud of as well. A man that never forgets the little people, back at home he was known for contributing to any city project that was aimed at bettering the lives of the citizens, and would receive his public support as well as financial investments. One fine example of this was when the city planned to put together a musical union. A meeting was held at the Maxwell House Hotel, of which Nelson attended and was the last person to speak regarding the matter. He praised the need for the arts, and even signed his entire family up as lifetime members on the spot, writing a check for $200, and eventually becoming the first president of the musical union. His wholehearted efforts to contribute to the growing city of Nashville and to provide better standards for all who lived here were almost positively the driving force behind all of his successful ventures and anything tied to his name. He gave freely and openly to charities as well as people in need. In an article, it is printed that he had a heart for pity and a hand as open as the day for melting charity. In other words, he had a soft heart for those in obvious need. And it was said that if a man offered to work for $50 a month, but Nelson believed the man to be worth 100, then he would pay the man 100. He always paid a man for what he was worth, not what he would take. Charles was also known for his hospitality at home. Guests were treated as if they were family, and his family themselves spoke of him as a man who laid his troubles at the door and never let his work interfere with his life. During Christmas, while his children were young, he would purchase the most beautiful tree he could find and would provide special surprises for his family. Once the children were grown and had moved to other states, they would come together at least twice a year, once for Charles's birthday and once for Christmas. The family home resided on what was once called South College Street, today's 3rd Avenue, I believe, but if this building is still standing today, I don't know. On December 13th, 1891, Charles passed away at his home. The cause of death was listed as a buildup of congestion in his lungs after having been confined to his bed for around a week prior, but his condition had slowly gotten worse as the days went on. The news of his passing shocked his family and neighbors, who were not only saddened by the loss of Nelson, but also saddened that the world had lost such a kind, charitable, and honest man. He left behind an estate valued at the time of over $1 million. His wife Louisa then took over the business, becoming one of few women to run a distillery at the time. The distillery remained successful throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. That was until 1909 when Tennessee banned the manufacture of alcohol, causing the facility and others around to close their doors for good. This would be the last time that Greenbrier Distillery would ever be in operation again. When the distillery closed, the family invested their fortune into other opportunities such as banking. The only distilleries that would revive after this would be the Cascade Distillery, known for its parent owner and distributor, George A. Dickel and Company, and the Jack Daniel Distillery. The bustling site came to a halt. The valves to the spring house were closed and the water was allowed to flow to the creek once again. All of the doors were boarded up and the building sat empty, quiet, restless. The insides of the facility were eventually dismantled and sold off before the remaining shells of what was once a thriving and large complex of steel, wood, and rock buildings were left to decay over time. And they did. Having sat uncared for, almost all of the buildings became a pile of scrap materials that were utilized in the construction of other buildings in the area or piled into large masses by the creek. The last addition to the facility, the 5,000-barrel capacity warehouse, is still standing. It rests alongside Distillery Road and has withstood many years of storms, blizzards, drunk drivers, and careless adventurers. It was one of the buildings that survived to be used for farming needs and tobacco smoking purposes. A small workshop and storage shed was added to the back later on, where you can actually look up at the warehouse and see where a building of almost similar height once adjoined it. I found an article mentioning this building being finished in 1905. Behind the warehouse and nestled directly over the creek, you will find the building used for grain, corn, and empty barrel storage. The building was placed in this specific spot due to the shadow that cast over it and the creek running below, keeping the building at a favorable temperature for the storage of said needed goods. The building has begun the process of falling into the creek as well. The supports underneath have split and it soon will become a pile of debris that will need to be removed unless something is done to secure it. Surrounding it are the foundations of the fallen buildings. I felt this really gives you a better idea of how big the site really was compared to what you see today. I found several pits that seemed like they were once storage for either water, mash, or possibly just leftover from the distillation process. If you know, let me know in the comments. Finally, across the creek and up the hill a bit, rests the slowly crumbling spring house. You can see where the original pipe once ran before the larger pipe to the right was added for the city water supply later on. The door has since fallen in, but you can still see the wood remains here and there. The roof has been repaired over time, but the building's original brick is beginning to separate and crack. The picnic table is since broken as well, and still rests in front of the building. If the building isn't saved soon, it too will be lost. In 1885, Greenbrier Distillery alone was paying $341,000 in taxes annually and was the largest producer in Tennessee. The existence of Greenbrier Distillery, along with several others in the area, allowed Robertson County to be hit less hard by the financial panic of 1873. While the history of this site is told to the local schoolchildren, it is easy to forgive them for overlooking the true historical significance of this site. Today, the field is relatively quiet, except for the occasional passing of a car and the constant flow of rushing spring water flowing from a broken pipe to the water tank once used by the city. If you find yourself visiting the site, try to imagine the buildings that once covered the field. Imagine the copper still that produced one of the most famous whiskeys to ever come from Tennessee. Try to picture the white painted picket fence that once lined the property, complementing the red fire brick and wood buildings behind. Picture the small site that one man turned into a fortune and created a whiskey brand legend. If you can't help but want a taste of what all the fuss was about back in the glory days when the distillery was still in business, then you're in luck. By chance, descendants of Charles ran across the old rusted warehouse building around 2006 after visiting a local butcher and have since revived the brand under its original name and registered number. Also by chance, as if by fate, they ran across an old article from a tour done by a journalist at the original facility, and right there on the page was the original recipe for one of the more famous brands that Charles had. Realizing their destiny, the men opened Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery in Nashville, not far from where their great-great-great-grandfather's warehouse and counting room on 2nd Avenue North was. Thanks to these two men, Old Number 5 and the legacy of Charles Nelson lives on.